Today on the John Ankerberg Show, where did we come from? How did we get here? What brought us into existence? In most high schools and colleges, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution is presented as an established fact of science rather than a theory. But today, many leading scientists in their peer-reviewed literature are rejecting Darwin's theory for many reasons. One of the most important being the Cambrian explosion of animals, where complex, fully formed animals suddenly just appeared in the fossil record with no prior ancestors before them. Why do some scientists believe that these animals present compelling evidence of an all-powerful designing intelligence in the history of life? My guest today is Dr. Stephen Meyer, who received his PhD in the philosophy of science from Cambridge University, as the author of the best-selling book, Darwin's Doubt. We invite you to join us. Welcome to our program. I'm John Ankerberg. Thanks for joining me. Our topic is, why are many scientists today rejecting the standard textbook theory of evolution, known as neo-Darwinism, that we all learn in high school and college textbooks? And where do the problems with contemporary evolutionary theory begin? Well, in the next several weeks, we're going to take a fresh look at the theory of evolution and the scientific problems confronting it with scientist and philosopher Dr. Stephen Meyer. Dr. Meyer is a former geophysicist who received his PhD in the philosophy of science from Cambridge University. And he's written 2 best-selling books, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt. In Darwin's Doubt, Dr. Meyer tells how Darwin himself doubted the ability of his own theory to explain a crucial piece of evidence, and how that doubt has grown up to create a major crisis in evolutionary thinking today. Darwin was troubled by a major event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion, in which the first major groups of animals appeared abruptly in the fossil record. Dr. Meyer, we're glad that you're here. And today I want to begin with a clip from Illustra Media's beautiful documentary movie, Darwin's Dilemma, which asks, how could the complex animals in the Cambrian explosion suddenly come into existence? I want you to watch.
An ancient mystery is etched upon these mountains. A story of primordial oceans and prehistoric life, of creatures stranger than fiction, and the controversy that has surrounded them for more than a century. Buried among these majestic peaks are glimpses of an event that transformed the planet in a moment of geological time. Compelling evidence, etched in stone, that challenges long-held assumptions about the origin of animal life on Earth. Today, most paleontologists think that complex animals first appeared on Earth about 530 million years ago, during a geological period known as the Cambrian. But early in the 19th century, little was understood about this seminal
Now, Dr. Meyer, you've written a best-selling book called Darwin's Doubt. What was the doubt that Charles Darwin had, and what is the Cambrian explosion? Why is it so important?
Well, Darwin had a doubt about an event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion. And the Cambrian explosion is the geologically sudden or abrupt appearance of most of the major groups of animals that have ever existed on Earth. And this is a dramatic event in the history of life because it documents the appearance of the first major complex animal forms and the fact that these animal forms appear so suddenly in the fossil record, which was something that was really contrary to Darwin's thinking about the history of life, which was something that he was acutely aware of and which bothered him, as the film said, right into the end of his life.
Yeah. Well, we're going to introduce this topic as we go along, and I want to go to this next clip, and we're going to show how the fossils in the Cambrian explosion came to be found. I mean, this is fascinating for folks. Watch.
More than a century ago, a stunning window to the Cambrian explosion was opened by a series of discoveries made in Western Canada. In 1886, the Canadian Pacific Railroad reached British Columbia and the Kicking Horse Valley. For the first time, eastern and western Canada were linked by a 2,500-mile steel artery that opened the Rocky Mountains to tourists, adventurers, and men of science. Among them was the geologist R.G. McConnell. Earlier in the year, McConnell had heard reports of a shale bed on the flank of Mount Stephen, just outside the town of Field. Railroad carpenters who had explored the area said it was filled with stone bugs. In September, McConnell climbed the mountain. To his amazement, he found unmistakable imprints of prehistoric life on most of the shales in the bed. McConnell was standing in an ocean of fossilized trilobites.
Trilobites are icons to the Cambrian, and there are billions of trilobites high up on the shoulder of Mount Stephen. And one reason for that is that as they grew, they periodically threw off their old skeleton and made a new skeleton. So basically they made many fossils through their individual lives.
McConnell collected hundreds of these fossils and sent many of them to other scientists for examination. News of his work soon reached the offices of the United States Geological Survey and Charles Doolittle Walcott, a leading expert on Cambrian paleontology. On August 30th, 1909, Walcott led his team below this ridge, 15 miles north of Mount Stephen. There, legend holds, he stopped to examine a pile of shale that blocked the narrow horse trail. As he picked up a slab, the geologist noticed a faint but well-defined fossil he had never seen before, a delicate lace crab he later named Morella.
He knew plenty and plenty about the Cambrian. He was an expert on the Cambrian. He published many papers. And when you see this little Morella, it's only about 1 centimetre in length. You get out your hand lens, and you suddenly see that this is, shouldn't be there. This is soft-bodied, effectively. And I'm sure he realised in seconds what it meant. He must have.
All right, Dr. Meyer, why were these Burgess fossils so important?
Well, the fossils of the Burgess Shale documented that the Cambrian explosion was even more explosive than Darwin had realized. Now, Darwin was really troubled by the Cambrian explosion, and just from the fossils that he knew, trilobites and a range of other forms. But he anticipated that future fossil finds would fill in the missing ancestors in the lower Precambrian rocks so that the history of life would look like a great branching tree, as I have on the slide here. But unfortunately, what was discovered from the standpoint of a Darwinian theory was that you had this sudden appearance of all the first complex forms of animal life, but the ancestral forms, the slightly simpler forms in the lower Precambrian strata, were not present. And the Burgess Shale, rather than documenting those ancestral forms, actually documented a range of new complex animals that even Darwin didn't know about. And so, in effect, the discoveries of the Burgess Shale showed that the Cambrian explosion had been even more explosive than Darwin anticipated. And so the mystery of those missing fossils was even more acute.
And the discoveries in the fossil record were just beginning. And as the paleontologists continue to dig, as we're going to see in this next clip, what they found next was astonishing. I want you to watch.
In the summer of 1910, Walcott found a fossiliferous band in the ridge. After blasting a quarry, the geologist and his family unearthed thousands of exquisitely preserved specimens from soft-bodied animals previously unknown to science. He called the site the Burgess Shale.
There in Burgess Shale, especially the lower level which Walcott first exploited, the preservation is miraculous, it's astonishing. We find trilobites, of course, but we find many, many other sorts of arthropods, almost none of which are ever found in a typical Cambrian assemblage. So we can treat them effectively as being soft-bodied. They have almost no chance of being fossilized in normal circumstances.
Geologists believe that the animals of the Burgess Shale were buried quickly and alive by an avalanche of sediment that created an airtight tomb and prevented the decay of soft body parts like eyes, legs, and internal organs.
Now, in the animal morella, very often there's a sort of what we call a dark stain. And I find this very intriguing because that dark stain evidently is the body contents are oozing out. So in other words, the animal is beginning to decay and then something stops it.
The Burgess Shale was once part of a massive reef in the Pacific Ocean, a haven for a menagerie of life that thrived at the edge of what is now the North American continent. Throughout long periods of geologic upheaval, tectonic forces elevated these rocks and the fossils they bear more than 7,000 feet above sea level. Here, the basic body plans of major animal groups that still exist today, and many others now extinct, made their first appearance in the fossil record so suddenly that biologist Richard Dawkins noted, "It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history."
All right, Stephen, let's tell the folks why we're showing them all this information. Why were the Burgess Shale fossils such a surprise?
Well, they were a major challenge to Darwin's theory, and they challenged Darwin's theory in two different ways. First, they challenged his picture of the history of life. As I mentioned before, Darwin had depicted the history of life as a great branching tree where the animal forms at the top of the tree represented all the forms of life that exist today. And at the very base of the tree, there was represented by a single one-celled organism, and then all the branches, connecting branches, represented how that single first organism gradually morphed and changed and became many different things over long periods of geological time. And so the first animal forms, according to Darwin, should have arisen very gradually through a series of small incremental variations and steps. But instead they appear very abruptly. So rather than a tree-like picture of the history of life, the Cambrian fossil record documents something much more like a lawn or an orchard of separate trees that never quite connect at the base. And so you have this sudden appearance and challenges the picture of the history of life. It also challenges Darwin's idea of the mechanism by which living forms would have arisen. His idea was that natural selection, the mechanism of natural selection, would have acted on small incremental variations that would have accumulated over many, many, many generations. And therefore, that life would have arisen very, very gradually over time. The first complex animals would have arisen very gradually. But instead what we see in the fossil record is this abrupt appearance of complexity, of complex animal forms. And this is also very contrary to Darwin's thinking about the mechanism of how these organisms would have arisen.
Yeah, and part of the evidence, what we're going to see next, is how complex the animals that were found in the Burgess Shale, how actually complex they were. I want you folks to watch. Why nothing distressed Darwin more than the Cambrian explosion? I first want you to hear what Charles Darwin himself said. Watch.
In 1859, this country estate, 30 miles south of London, was ground zero for a scientific revolution. Here, in the solitude of his study, Charles Darwin completed his landmark book on the origin of species. In it, Darwin attempted to explain how every organism that had ever lived evolved from a single common ancestor as a result of natural selection acting on random variations. Common descent and natural selection became the twin pillars of modern biology, and Darwin's branching tree of life its foremost icon. Yet despite the clarity and detail of his argument, Darwin acknowledged a problem that defied explanation: the Cambrian fossil record.
The distinctness of specific forms and their not being blended together by innumerable transitional links is a very obvious difficulty. I allude to the manner in which species belonging to several of the main divisions of the animal kingdom suddenly appear in the lowest known fossiliferous rocks.
When Darwin was writing The Origin of Species, it was well known at the time that the first fossils of animals appeared suddenly without precursors in the geological record. So there was a deep conflict between what his theory told him to expect to find, namely an abundance of transitional forms going back to that common ancestor for the animals, versus what was there in the fossil record.
Darwin knew that if his theory was true, the older rock strata directly beneath the Cambrian layer should reveal a progression of fossils connecting simple earlier forms to complex animals like trilobites through a trail of incremental steps and failed biological experiments. Such evidence would document the trial and error process of natural selection.
But Darwin says in The Origin, where are these transitional forms? They're not there in the fossil record. What we see instead are fully formed, discrete groups. Now that's a world-class puzzle for someone like Darwin.
If my theory be true, it is indisputable that before the lowest Cambrian stratum was deposited, long periods elapsed, and during these periods of time, the world swarmed with living creatures. To the question of why we do not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earlier periods prior to the Cambrian, I can give no satisfactory answer.
Dr. Meyer, why were these fossils in the Burgess Shale so challenging to Darwin's theory of evolution?
Well, the fossils of the Burgess Shale, as well as all the other Cambrian fossil beds that have been discovered, raise two mysteries. Create two mysteries for Darwin's theory, and they were the source of his doubt about the ability of his theory to explain the whole of the evidence. And the first mystery I call the mystery of the missing fossils, and the film clip there documents it very well, that you have the first major complex animal forms arising in the Cambrian, and as you look in the lower Precambrian strata, you don't find the ancestral precursors to those fossils that you would expect to find if Darwin's picture of the history of life is true. And the second mystery is closely related to it, and I call this the mystery of how you build an animal. How would the evolutionary process build an animal? According to Darwin, the process by which complex animal life arose was the process of natural selection acting on small incremental variations. And Darwin understood that the variations would need to be small and incremental, because if there was a large change in the form of an animal from one generation to the next, that would be something like a birth defect or a deformity, and he understood that those kind of gross changes would always be deleterious or detrimental. So instead, the changes that would occur from generation to generation that would be the source of the evolutionary change over time had to be very small and incremental, which meant that the process needed to take a great deal of time. And instead, what we see in the fossil record is this abrupt appearance without the ancestors and without any evidence of that slow, gradual trial and error process having occurred over time. So the Cambrian explosion raises two mysteries: the mystery of the missing fossils and the mystery of what is the process by which all this complexity came about.
All right, folks. Now, next week, we're going to see that paleontologists continue to discover new fossils. And as they did, they began to realize that the Cambrian explosion was an even bigger problem than Darwin had ever imagined. And we're going to find out why next week, so I hope that you'll join us. Stay tuned for scenes from next week's program. If you would like to have all of the information in our new series, The Mystery of the Missing Fossils, featuring Dr. Stephen Meyer, all 4 half-hour television programs are available on DVD for a gift of $49. You will see the astonishing evidence that has led scientists to conclude that fully developed, complex animals suddenly appeared on Earth during the Cambrian Age and had no prior ancestors, and why this fossil evidence goes directly against Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, why an all-powerful intelligent designer is a better scientific explanation than Darwinism for the sudden appearance of fully formed animals in the fossil record. The 4 important programs in this series are available on DVD for a gift of $49. Then our second series is entitled The Case for Intelligent Design. Charles Darwin admitted he did not know how the first cell came into existence. But today, molecular biologists have discovered that the human cell is not simple, but complex beyond belief. In the nucleus of each cell is the DNA molecule, which contains a storehouse of 3 billion characters of precise information in digital code. This digital code is crucial to the origin and function of all plants, animals, and humans. But where did this complex DNA code come from? And is an all-powerful intelligent designer a better scientific explanation than Darwinism for the genetic information found in the DNA molecule? The 4 television programs in this series are also available on DVD for a gift of $49. And then third, we are making available the documentary movie Darwin's Dilemma, which will transport you by state-of-the-art computer animation back in time to one of the great mysteries in the history of life, the geologically sudden appearance of dozens of major complex animal types in the fossil record, without any trace of the gradual transition steps. You will learn of the vast intelligence God used in meticulously creating and designing the first animals. This documentary movie is available on DVD for a gift of $30. And finally, if you wish to order all 3 of these items together, that is both television series plus the documentary movie Darwin's Dilemma, they are available together in a special package for only $100. And to order now, you may call 1-800-805-3030. That's 1-800-805-3030. Or you may order these programs now at our website at jashow.org. Next week on The John Ankerberg Show,
I tell the story of the doubt that Darwin had, and I show how that doubt has grown up to become a major crisis in evolutionary theory.
And today I want to begin with a clip from Illustra Media's beautiful documentary movie, Darwin's Dilemma, which describes the turmoil scientists experienced when they discovered that the earliest animals in the fossil record appeared abruptly without any evidence of prior ancestors. I want you to watch.
The Burgess Shale was once part of a massive reef in the Pacific Ocean, a haven for a menagerie of life that thrived at the edge of what is now the North American continent. Throughout long periods of geologic upheaval, tectonic forces elevated these rocks and the fossils they bear more than 7,000 feet above sea level. Here, the basic body plans of major animal groups that still exist today, and many others now extinct, made their first appearance in the fossil record so suddenly that biologist Richard Dawkins noted, "It is as though they were just planted there without any evolutionary history." These fossils gave science its first detailed look at the biology of the Cambrian seas. With computer animation, we can now bring that world to life. First described in 1899, many of which are still studied in museums and research centers around the world. But the treasures of the Burgess Shale represent more than a wealth of information about ancient life. They are also flashpoints in a controversy that began long before the great geologist ever set foot in the Canadian Rockies.
You know, Dr. Meyer, just looking at that video clip, the animals that were found there, those fossil remains, were really well-developed animals, complex animals. Why did these fossils pose such a challenge to the accepted evolutionary theory about how life originated on Earth?
Well, there were two reasons that the discovery of these Cambrian animals created a doubt for Darwin about the adequacy of his own theory, and he acknowledged this in The Origin of Species. The first reason had to do with Darwin's picture of the history of life, the way he depicted life's history. We all remember from our biology textbooks, he represented the history of life as a great branching tree, and the animal tree of life would have had at the top of the tree the first complex forms of animal life, and those forms would have arisen, according to Darwin's thinking, as a result of a series of slow, gradual transformations from some common ancestral form way back in the pre-Cambrian times. But instead of the branching tree picture of the history of life being documented in the fossil record, what we actually see in the fossil record of the emergence of complex animals, is that most of the first complex animal forms of animal life, the major groups of animals, appear very abruptly in the fossil record without any discernible connection to simpler ancestral forms in the lower Precambrian strata. And so you have this contrast between the Darwinian picture of the history of life, which I show in this slide on the bottom, and the actual pattern in the fossil record. And you can see there's a very great contrast between the theory that Darwin put forward of the history of life and the actual evidence in the fossil record. So you have a challenge from the evidence of the theory. The second problem that Darwin recognized, and which also troubled him, was that the Cambrian explosion posed a challenge to his idea about how these animals had been built. He had proposed that the mechanism of natural selection acting on small incremental variations would have acted very gradually and slowly over a long period of time to produce the complex forms of life. But instead, what we see in the fossil record, again, is the abrupt appearance of these forms of life with no evidence that they arose as a result of a slow, gradually acting process. And so the Cambrian fossil record not only challenged his picture of the history of life, but it also challenged his ideas about the mechanism by which complex living forms would have arisen.
Yeah. All right, folks. Now, in this next clip, I want to show you what Charles Darwin himself wrote in his book on the origin of species, what he predicted paleontologists should find in the fossil record if his theory of evolution was correct. I want you to watch.
In 1859, this country estate, 30 miles south of London, was ground zero for a scientific revolution. Here, in the solitude of his study, Charles Darwin completed his landmark book on the origin of species. In it, Darwin attempted to explain how every organism that had ever lived evolved from a single common ancestor as a result of natural selection acting on random variations.
The idea of evolution itself, change over time, was not novel with Darwin. What Darwin did that was, I think, really revolutionary was to advance a hypothesis of common ancestry, that all living things were related.
He would have a branching tree pattern, and for a long time you would only have that one species, and then it would eventually branch into two species, and then more species, and different families and orders and classes. And Darwin's thinking, given enough time, those differences accumulate, especially under natural selection, if the environment changes. Those differences accumulate to the point where 1,000 or 1,000,000 generations from now, your great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren will be a different species.
So it is both logically and almost aesthetically a unifying picture, a unifying image that pulls together the whole of life on Earth. And for many biologists, that kind of unification is very important.
Common descent and natural selection became the twin pillars of modern biology, and Darwin's branching tree of life its foremost icon. Yet despite the clarity and detail of his argument, Darwin acknowledged a problem that defied explanation: the Cambrian fossil record.
The distinctness of specific forms and their not being blended together by innumerable transitional links is a very obvious difficulty. I allude to the manner in which species belonging to several of the main divisions of the animal kingdom suddenly appear in the lowest known fossiliferous rocks.
When Darwin was writing The Origin of Species, it was well known at the time that the first fossils of animals appeared suddenly without precursors in the geological record. So there was a deep conflict between what his theory told him to expect to find, namely an abundance of transitional forms going back to that common ancestor for the animals, versus what was there in the fossil record.
Darwin knew that if his theory was true, the older rock strata directly beneath the Cambrian layer should reveal a progression of fossils connecting simple earlier forms to complex animals like trilobites through a trail of incremental steps and failed biological experiments. Such evidence would document the trial and error process of natural selection.
But Darwin says in The Origin, where are these transitional forms? They're not there in the fossil record. What we see instead are fully formed, discrete groups. Now that's a world-class puzzle for someone like Darwin.
And so it's very, very striking, and one can see why Charles Darwin was so puzzled by the Cambrian explosion, because he had enough knowledge even at that time to realize that deep in the Earth history, you just didn't find the animals.
If my theory be true, it is indisputable that before the lowest Cambrian stratum was deposited, long periods elapsed, and during these periods of time, the world swarmed with living creatures. To the question of why we do not find rich fossiliferous deposits belonging to these assumed earlier periods prior to the Cambrian, I can give no satisfactory answer.
All right, Dr. Meyer, Charles Darwin was a brilliant man. When he was faced with this evidence, how did he try and solve this problem?
Well, he had a charming analogy that he developed that in which he likened the history of life, in particular the fossil record, to a book with many chapters in it. And he said, if we can think of the fossil record as a series of layers where the layers represent just different chapters in the history of life, we may have a situation where we have some chapters that have been lost and where we maybe only have a page in one chapter or where there's a complete chapter missing. And so he essentially tried to explain the absence of the ancestral fossils of these Cambrian animals, which he expected on his theory to be there. He explained away the absence of these fossils as a result of the imperfection in the fossil record, that either we hadn't found these fossils yet because we hadn't looked hard enough, or perhaps some layers, for whatever reason, were not preserved. They were eroded away. And so he tried to explain it away that way and analogized it to a book where some of the chapters of the book had been torn out.
Yeah. Well, we've got to acknowledge that in spite of this evidence, the fossil evidence, Darwin did not give up on his theory of evolution. And what he proposed, we want to look at next. So here's our next clip I want you folks to watch.
Darwin was deeply troubled by the Cambrian explosion. He called it an inexplicable mystery. But he wasn't about to abandon his theory and instead proposed that the animals just looked like they appeared suddenly because he thought that the fossil record was incomplete.
I look at the natural geological record as a history of the world imperfectly kept and written in a changing dialect. Of this history, we possess the last volume alone, relating only to 2 or 3 countries. Of this volume, only here and there a short chapter has been preserved, and of each page, only here and there a few lines.
So Darwin argued, well, perhaps paleontological discovery, digging through the rocks, needed more time, that the transitions were out there, that not enough collecting had occurred, not enough sampling, if you will, of the fossil record on Earth. And given time, those transitions would turn up.
All right, Stephen, if Darwin was waiting for new fossil discoveries to solve the mystery of the missing ancestor fossils, what have the new discoveries in paleontology shown us?
Well, that's the really remarkable thing, and that's what's so significant about the Burgess Shale, the great discovery that was made in Western Canada in the early part of the 20th century. New fossils have turned up, but rather than ameliorating or eliminating the mystery of the Cambrian explosion, they've actually made the mystery more acute, because what the new fossil finds have shown, both in the Burgess Shale and also other fossil finds, in particular one in China, what these new finds have shown is that there were many more Cambrian animals, complex animals, that arose in the Cambrian period than even Darwin knew. And so the explosion was, if you will, more explosive than he understood. And for each of these new forms of Cambrian animal life that arose, each of these were in turn lacking discernible ancestors in the lower strata. So whereas before you had a pattern with a group of complex animals arising, each of which was lacking ancestors in the lower strata, now you have an even wider array of new complex animal forms arising abruptly, again, with each of those new forms missing ancestors. So you're looking at an even more explosive pattern as a result of these new discoveries.
Yeah, and even as you said in your book, okay, Darwin's Doubt, you said even a child can look and see that these animals that just appeared are different, they're more complex, or they're very complex. They're really something to look at.
Well, it might be helpful for your audience to get a sense of just how dramatic this event is in the history of life, because there are about 36 phyla, and a phylum is the largest division of animal classification. So there are about 36 phyla in the history of life. About 26 or 27 of those phyla are fossilized, And of those that are fossilized, fully 20 of the phyla first appear in the Cambrian. There are representatives of those phyla that first appear in the Cambrian period. So this is a big event in the history of life. A lot of the new form and structure, the new body plans that have existed on planet Earth first arrived during that period of time, and they do so very abruptly without clear connections to ancestral forms in the lower strata.
That's why they call it a Cambrian explosion. It's boom, it's there. Folks, I want you to watch this next clip because new fossil discoveries have been uncovered. Let's learn a little bit more about the Burgess Shale site. Watch this.
3 decades after Darwin's death, Charles Walcott's historic work in the Canadian Rockies did nothing to fill the gaps in the tree of life or the fossil record. Walcott uncovered the remains of Cambrian animals unknown to Darwin, and each demanded its own unique progression of evolutionary ancestors, a trail of evidence that did not exist in the Burgess Shale.
Walcott realized that the Cambrian explosion of life was an even bigger problem than Darwin imagined. So, in an attempt to defend evolution, he reached back to Darwin's explanation of an incomplete fossil record.
Like Darwin, Walcott thought that the Cambrian explosion was an illusion. He was convinced that the fossils were there. They were just inaccessible to scientific discovery, and he expected that they would eventually be found someplace buried deep beneath the oceans.
For decades, Walcott's hypothesis was widely accepted, but untestable. However, later in the 20th century, new technologies led to empirical conclusions.
Once the oil companies started to drill offshore, they brought up what are called drill cores, and inside the core were hunks of sedimentary rock, and some of those rocks contained fossils, but none of them were made by animals that lived before the Cambrian explosion.
Since the 1960s, scientists have also used radioactive minerals and evidence of changes in the Earth's magnetic field to analyze and date undersea sediments. From extensive surveys, they have created this digital map that defines the age of the seafloor.
We now know that the oldest rocks on the bottom of the seafloor only date back to the Jurassic period, which means that on the standard geologic time scale, they're hundreds of millions of years younger than the rocks below the Cambrian strata.
If you are looking for the ancestors to the Cambrian groups, the last place you would expect to find them is out somewhere on the seafloor. Those rocks are much too young.
So how did the Cambrian animals emerge, and where are the signs of their evolutionary past? Darwin and Walcott both confronted and failed to solve this mystery.
Now, Stephen, if the Burgess Shale didn't solve the problems that Darwin and Walcott confronted, did any subsequent discoveries do that?
There have been some subsequent and very dramatic new fossil finds dating from the Cambrian period and from Precambrian rocks as well. But unfortunately, from a Darwinian point of view, these discoveries also have made the mystery of the Cambrian explosion and the mystery of the missing fossils even more acute. There has been a major find in southern China. The first discovery started coming out in the mid-'80s, and these were just exquisitely preserved fossils. And oddly, the fossils that were discovered in southern China were even more exquisitely preserved, even more beautifully preserved, with almost a photographic realism in the fossil impressions. The other thing that came to light because of this Chinese find was that, again, there were even more new complex animal forms alive at that time than we knew of from either the Burgess Shale or from the earlier fossils in whales of which Darwin knew. So with each progressive discovery in paleontology, our awareness of the degree to which this explosive event was explosive has just increased.
Why is it we're not hearing this in our schools?
Well, it's really hard to say, but most of the textbooks don't even mention the Cambrian explosion, and those few that do mention the Cambrian explosion don't mention that it is a major problem for Darwinian thought. And one of the things I do in the book Darwin's Doubt is I tell the story of the doubt that Darwin had, and I show how that doubt has grown up to become a major crisis in evolutionary theory, not only because it raises this mystery of the missing ancestral fossils, but also because it raises a deeper mystery about the evolutionary process itself. It's a mystery I call the mystery of how to build an animal. What process is there that could build these complex animals and do so in the very limited amount of geologic time that is available to the evolutionary process? It's actually a very big problem.
Yeah, I mean, folks, we are just getting started. Wait till you hear when Dr. Meyer starts talking about how animals are made, okay, and what scientists have discovered. Next week, we're going to show you that the plot only thickens as paleontologists continue to discover what the planet looked like before the trilobites and morillas first inhabited the seas. And folks, you won't want to miss this. I hope you'll join us then. Stay tuned for scenes from next week's program. If you would like to have all of the information in our new series, The Mystery of the Missing Fossils, featuring Dr. Stephen Meyer, all 4 half-hour television programs are available on DVD for a gift of $49. You will see the astonishing evidence that has led scientists to conclude that fully developed, complex animals suddenly appeared on Earth during the Cambrian Age and had no prior ancestors, and why this fossil evidence goes directly against Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, why an all-powerful intelligent designer is a better scientific explanation than Darwinism for the sudden appearance of fully formed animals in the fossil record. The 4 important programs in this series are available on DVD for a gift of $49. Then our second series is entitled The Case for Intelligent Design. Charles Darwin admitted he did not know how the first cell came into existence. But today, molecular biologists have discovered that the human cell is not simple, but complex beyond belief. In the nucleus of each cell is the DNA molecule, which contains a storehouse of 3 billion characters of precise information in digital code. This digital code is crucial to the origin and function of all plants, animals, and humans. But where did this complex DNA code come from? And is an all-powerful intelligent designer a better scientific explanation than Darwinism for the genetic information found in the DNA molecule? The 4 television programs in this series are also available on DVD for a gift of $49. And then third, we are making available the documentary movie Darwin's Dilemma, which will transport you by state-of-the-art computer animation back in time to one of the great mysteries in the history of life, the geologically sudden appearance of dozens of major complex animal types in the fossil record, without any trace of the gradual transition steps. You will learn of the vast intelligence God used in meticulously creating and designing the first animals. This documentary movie is available on DVD for a gift of $30. And finally, if you wish to order all 3 of these items together, that is both television series plus the documentary movie Darwin's Dilemma, they are available together in a special package for only $100. And to order now, you may call 1-800-805-3030. That's 1-800-805-3030. Or you may order these programs now at our website at jashow.org. Next week on the John Ankerberg Show,
there are many paleontologists now who are acknowledging that the Cambrian explosion is a real event and that it does pose a challenge to the textbook theory of evolution that we all learned called neo-Darwinism.
Of the mudstone.
The fossils they've collected, I mean, first of all, they're stunning. I mean, they're really beautiful to look at.
They're brightly colored, stained with iron and probably other kinds of minerals, so they're kind of golden looking or kind of reddish, and they really stand out from the rather tan colored background of the rocks, and they're just beautiful. So aesthetically they're wonderful.
Many of them are soft-bodied. No hard parts, no skeletons, no shells, just soft-bodied, and yet they're exquisitely preserved. So you can see the Cambrian explosion in greater detail than you can anywhere else in the world.
In the early 1990s, reports of the Chinese fossils were released to the rest of the world. At the University of San Francisco, marine biologist Paul Chien followed the news.
What drew my attention was, in fact, a couple articles published in People's Daily, the official paper from the Communist Party in China, announced that the Chengjiang fossils drew the attention of scientists worldwide. People's Daily reported that this find actually challenges the theory of Darwin's evolution.
Since 1996, Paul Chien has made several trips to southern China to conduct his own investigations.
The Cambrian explosion does challenge the traditional idea of gradual evolution of animals because they all seem to appear all of a sudden, and the problem is, how do we explain it?
Paleontologists have determined that the Chinese fossils were older than those excavated at the Burgess Shale. Yet anatomically, they were often even more complex. This discovery also confirmed that previous estimates of an explosion lasting 20 to 40 million years were much too long.
The time period that we figured it took the animals to be established in the ocean in those days took probably 10 million, 5 million years. So this is truly an explosive event in the scientific terms. What we are seeing is a quantum jump, and this quantum jump has no explanation.
As the interval of the Cambrian explosion is compressed, in other words, as the time available shrinks, the challenge to evolutionary theory grows, because the differences in form that have to be constructed very rapidly are much more dramatic. It's going to pose a real, and I think fundamental challenge to evolutionary mechanisms.
From what I saw, the Chinese scientific community as a whole seemed to be rather progressive around this. They are convinced by the evidence that the Cambrian explosion is real. And they see it's a challenge to the Darwinian theory. They are honest about it. Therefore, they are thinking about how to explain this outside of the Darwinian thoughts.
Now, Dr. Meyer, this stuff is amazing, okay? And given how quickly these complex animals arose and the absence of prior ancestors, how have the neo-Darwinian paleontologists attempted to explain the missing Precambrian ancestral fossils?
Well, as Dr. Chen alluded to, there are many paleontologists now who are acknowledging that the Cambrian explosion is a real event and that it does pose a challenge to the textbook theory of evolution that we all learn called neo-Darwinism. But there are still defenders of neo-Darwinism out there, and what they have typically proposed to explain away the absence of these ancestral forms is something called the artifact hypothesis. And what the artifact hypothesis is it's a kind of modified version of the idea that Darwin put forward in the 19th century, that we're not seeing the ancestral forms either because we haven't looked hard enough or because for some reason these ancestral forms were not preserved. So the technical way of referring to that is the idea that the missing ancestral animals to the Cambrian animals that arise later, those ancestors are missing, and they're missing as an artifact of either incomplete sampling of the fossil record or as a result of incomplete preservation. Now, 150 years since the publication of The Origin of Species, and given all these different fossil finds, no one really can say we haven't looked hard enough anymore. So what people are now saying is that the fossils are missing because of incomplete preservation. And in particular, the idea that's put forward is that the missing ancestors weren't preserved because they were either too small or too soft to have been preserved. And that's the version of the artifact hypothesis that's still in currency. And yet there's been another discovery in China that has really challenged that idea. In fact, I think challenged it in a very fundamental way.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to go to next in this next clip, folks. What fossil evidence refutes the artifact hypothesis that the reason the missing links, the prior ancestors of the Cambrian animals, have not been found is because they were too soft and too small to have been preserved? I want you to watch this next clip.
The Xinjiang fossils provide the most inclusive picture of the Cambrian explosion yet documented. And directly beneath them, in Precambrian shales, another chapter in the history of life is written in the rocks.
There's another amazing find that's been made in China. Paleobiologists have discovered little tiny microscopic sponge embryos in the layers of rock just beneath the layer that documents the Cambrian explosion.
These embryos were soft-bodied animals. Some fossilized 60 million years before the Cambrian explosion.
They're eggs and embryos, which are preserved in thin crusts of mineralized material, a phosphatic material, on ancient seafloors, which suggests that the chemistry of the seawater in those days was somewhat different than it is today, because this method of preserving fossils disappears during the Cambrian, and it's not around today. So we're lucky that we have these thin crusts with little tiny fossils in them.
This is highly significant because one of the most popular explanations for the missing Precambrian fossils is that the Precambrian animals were too soft and too small to have been preserved.
Since 1999, Paul Chien has studied fossil embryos and helped develop techniques to analyze their structure.
By treating with acid, you can actually remove the rock and isolate the embryos, and then you get round pebble-like or sand grain-like samples. And then we look through some tiny little ones, larger ones up to 1 millimeter in size. And we found about the range between 500 and 800 micrometers. We have mostly sponge. And then I start breaking up these balls and try to start looking inside. And with the help of the electron microscope, I was able to see the detailed subcell structure within these embryos.
Chien's work on these fragile remnants of Precambrian life raises an important question.
If these lower strata can preserve an embryo, if they can preserve a soft microscopic embryo, then why couldn't they have preserved the larger ancestral forms that supposedly evolved into the Cambrian animals? In other words, if you can preserve something as fragile as an embryo, why couldn't you, in the same strata of rock, preserve the immediate ancestor of a hard-shelled trilobite?
So the idea that the fossil record is too damaged to provide us with at least a general picture, that idea just doesn't wash.
Stephen, what we just saw is incredible, and I can remember when I was in school having professors tell me, yeah, the missing links are missing because they're soft-bodied, and the fact is there's no way to keep them in the fossil record. That just went down the tubes with that last clip. What are neo-Darwinian paleontologists now saying about what they're going to do?
Well, I think we should just talk about paleontologists and Cambrian paleontologists, because I think increasingly many paleontologists are not necessarily committed to neo-Darwinism because it has so many problems. They're committed to some form of evolutionary theory typically, but now many leading paleontologists, certainly in China, but also leading American paleontologists, are saying that whatever we make of the Cambrian explosion, however we attempt to explain it, we have to start from the premise that this is a real event. It's not an artifact of incomplete sampling. It's not an artifact of incomplete preservation. It's a real event, and it has to be reckoned with. And some of the leading Chinese paleontologists, J.Y. Chen has been very outspoken in making this point. There's a major book on the Cambrian explosion that came out in 2013 by Doug Irwin of the Smithsonian Institution and James Valentine, who was shown in that previous clip from the University of California, Berkeley, in which they make this same point. The Cambrian is a real event. We may not have a good explanation for it, but we've got to reckon on the event as something that really happened. It's not just something that is a kind of illusion from our not being able to see what happened in the lower strata. We now have good reason to think that the lower strata, or the depositional environment in the Precambrian, was capable of preserving even small and soft organisms, and therefore the absence of the ancestral forms of the larger organisms with hard parts should certainly have been there if those animals existed, if those precursors existed. That they weren't preserved is best explained by the supposition that they weren't there.
Yeah. What does this do to the neo-Darwinian theory?
Well, it certainly, again, challenges the neo-Darwinian picture of the history of life. The first complex forms of animal life seem to arise very abruptly, and it also challenges the idea that the neo-Darwinian mechanism was the mechanism by which these complex forms of life arose, because that mechanism requires a vast amount of time, and it should have left behind a vast number of failed experiments, if you will. It's a trial and error mechanism where you get lots of different variations arising, different mutational changes arising. So we ought to see the evidence of all those failed trials in the lower strata, and they're not there. So it raises questions both about the pattern, the picture of the history of life that Darwin proposed, but also it raises questions about whether the mechanism of natural selection and random mutation is really what was at work in producing these first complex forms of animal life.
Yeah, set us up for next week, because we're going into what you really want to talk about, and that is the fact is we're getting to, in the fossil record, biologists are saying we now know a little bit about how animals are made, and that's a problem.
Well, in my book, Darwin's Doubt, I talk about two great mysteries. And the first mystery is pretty easy to comprehend. It's the mystery of the missing fossils. They're simply not there. What we'd expect to see in the lower Precambrian layers are not there. But I think there's an even deeper mystery. And that is the mystery that I call the engineering mystery. How do you build an animal? How would the evolutionary process build an animal, especially when you have such a compressed time scale? And that mystery has been made very much more acute by discoveries that have been made since Darwin's time, in particular discoveries in the field of molecular biology about the importance of information, digital codes stored in the DNA molecule, and the importance of that information to building animals. And as we've come to appreciate that building animals requires vast sections of digital information, essentially assembly instructions, the Cambrian explosion becomes an engineering problem. Where would all that information come from? How would it get built? Because we now know that you need that kind of information to build an animal.
Yeah. Now, folks, we're just starting to unscramble that for you, and it's a deep mystery, and Stephen is one of the world's best in explaining that, and we're going to attempt to show you what is needed in terms of information, genetic information of how you build an animal, and then we're going to ask the question, where did all of this information come from? We're going to start that next week. I hope you'll join us.